Okay, shall we start? My name is Naoyuki Haraoka, Executive Managing Director of Japan Economic Foundation. It's my great honor and pleasure to moderate this important BBL. The subject is very important. The title is Currently Asia's Response to the Collapsing Consensus on Trade. That has been our interest for a long time. Today's speaker, Dr. Deborah Elms, is definitely the appropriate person to introduce this important subject. She is the Executive Director and founder of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore, and also President of the Asia Business Trade Association, and the Board Director of the Asian Trade Center Foundation. Apparently, she is one of the most distinguished trade policy experts in the world. So, Dr. Elms, you have a floor. Please start the presentation.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really delighted to be able to present to this audience some of my thoughts about this changing global landscape that we have, particularly for trade. So let me pull out my slides. Yep, you have these, yes? Excellent, okay. So I'm gonna go through this slideshow here, and what I'm trying to do in particular is raise a number of questions. And if you have comments along the way, please do feel free to use the chat function. I have it open so I can see what questions are coming in, and if I can address them on the spot, I can do so. Otherwise, of course, we'll wait till the end. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about what are we gonna do on trade and trade policy in particular, because this is an unusual time, I would argue. As all of you, of course, know, we've had significant challenges even ahead of COVID. So there was a lot of pressure on the global trading regime. The biggest partners in particular, the United States, which I'll talk about in a minute, had prior to COVID engaged in all kinds of highly unusual, very different kinds of trade policies. And there was a growing discontent over the global trade regime even before COVID hit. In fact, I was giving seminars in late 2019 that we're talking about sort of, is trade the Titanic that has hit the iceberg, and now we're trying to sort out what happened. And then as if it wasn't bad enough that we had already hit the iceberg, then we have COVID. And COVID created some real challenges, as you all know, of course, for trade, but among them was shifts in both the supply and demand curves that was global. And so that created a set of disruption that we really rarely see on the trade side. And of course, you can see from all the statistics, the economic damage that fell from that, and in particular, the trade disruption that took place during COVID. Now that has given way, thankfully, to a new world in which we have less concerns about COVID, still dealing with some of the supply chain disruption, but it's getting better. But now we have this growing geopolitical tensions, particularly between the United States and China, over some extent of decoupling, some extent of thinking about trade in different ways. And so that is creating, as you certainly know, lots of issues in and across Japan and the rest of Asia. So I want to say in this talk today, and again, I'm really excited to get your feedback on this argument, that there are at least three challenges for trade. There are many, but I've condensed them down to three. The first one is that we have had and continue to have less global leadership, and in particular, less enthusiasm from major players, especially the United States, to support the existing system. The system, I will argue, is anchored on the World Trade Organization, but there are other elements to that that are not specifically about the WTO itself. The second thing that I think is different now and worth thinking about is that we now have new approaches to managing trade. And in particular, we have new kinds of trade agreements. And the proliferation of new kinds of trade agreements in new locations gives rise to a risk of fragmentation, where we are now starting to create rules that are either inconsistent or incompatible, particularly between regions. And that creates both opportunities to think about trade in new ways, but also, again, these risks of greater fragmentation. And there is a lingering, and I think important, uncertainty about whether or not our existing trade agreement models are fit for purpose or appropriate. So the traditional goods, services, investment, intellectual property rights, a couple of other things that are important to you, all bundled together into one trade agreement and negotiated either bilaterally or regionally is a model that has worked well for Asia for a while, but it's unclear whether that is going to be the model that goes forward. So I will go into all of these in a bit more detail. But what I think I need to note at the outset is that all of these alternatives are built on top of the World Trade Organization's commitments. And with the WTO looking incredibly shaky, that foundation for all of this other infrastructure built on top of it is also at risk. So how do we fix this problem? And I'm going to argue that there are at least three things we could do. So one, and this has been tried, but I do think that it's a challenge, is to get the bigger players to re-engage at the WTO. And I mean, I think that should be encouraged, whether it is likely to yield success or not, because it's important. It's certainly important to most of the rest of the global economy. I would argue it's especially critical for developing countries and developing countries in regions where there are no alternatives. So we really need the WTO system to function, especially for those members. So an alternative, or maybe in conjunction, because I think we should continue to try to get, especially the US, back on side in the WTO. An alternative to that is to encourage these coalitions of what are often called middle powers to try to shore up the system. And of course, Japan, although I don't think Japan personally is a middle power, is part of that initiative to say, how else can we structure this? How else can we create some coalitions of the willing if we need to fix different elements of the WTO and the trading system in general? And then a third approach, which is one that is being enthusiastically pursued, I think, here in Asia. Maybe enthusiastic is the wrong word, because most of Asia believes in the importance of the WTO, but sort of as an insurance policy, at least. Think about a network of trade agreements and try to make those trade agreements as much as possible have certain alignment of principles, norms of behavior, and outcomes, so that we continue to create sort of structures around the WTO to make sure that as much as we can, we have some kind of foundation that will work for the future. Now, Asia, of course, is at high risk. And in particular at high risk because this is a very trade dependent part of the global economy. I mean, I sit in Singapore where the trade to GDP figures are always like 300 to 400%. So much more trade than there is domestic economy. And if trade ends up becoming more and more protectionist, more and more nationalist, it becomes a real challenge for a place like Singapore and for a place like Japan, which also has been connected to the larger economy forever, really, but certainly in most people's lifetimes. And so I think it's important to realize the risk for Asia of a collapsing global trade system. And I think so far, we have a limited understanding of what that means. We have, of course, those of you who work directly with the WTO have a sense of the dysfunction of the WTO, but I think we have forgotten how relevant that WTO system is. And we have forgotten how that WTO system remains, again, the sort of base or the foundation for all of this sort of sexier new free trade agreements that are built on top of that. And so it's important, I think, to reflect already on what can you do to shore up that foundation, and what can you do if the foundation really goes or crumbles? How can we use those other structures to help create some kind of new structure that will not just implode when the foundation collapses? And so it's a little hard. It's early days, of course, in both the collapse of the WTO, the implications of that, but also, are the alternatives going to be fit for purpose? Now, one of the biggest problems clearly is the US. You know, the United States up until recently was willing to defend the value and the virtue of the system of trade and the importance of multilateral institutions as a mechanism for doing so. And the US was willing to shoulder a certain amount of domestic level consequences, in part to support this sort of global exercise. Now, I'm not going to say that they did this purely for altruism. The United States clearly got a lot of benefits out of the multilateral trading system. And I think companies in particular received an enormous amount of benefit from having global trade on consistent rules spread across as many markets as possible. That allowed the US economy to continue powering forward. So it's not that the US did this just because it felt like it was a good idea. It did it because it was also in their own interest. And what has happened recently, certainly in the last, let's call it 10 years, is a shift in policy, particularly by political parties, about whether or not the United States engagement in the multilateral trading system is a source of opportunity and optimism, or is a source of risk and dependence. And what you can see is that under the last administration and continuing into this administration, there is less tolerance for anyone who is seen to be free riding on the system or on US contributions, and a much greater enthusiasm for pursuing policies that are protectionist or nationalist, that would have been dismissed out of hand in the past, but are now increasingly embraced by the US. And in particular in Washington itself, including both parties in Congress. But I will note that public support among American citizens when polled is actually higher than ever for the importance of trade. So we have this really interesting dichotomy that at the moment when the US leadership has decided that trade is a problem for the US is the exact moment when the US public has decided that trade is actually important to them. So this weird disconnect, I think is challenging. And of course, the changing political structure in the US has complicated trade because traditionally the Democrats were more hostile to trade, more worried about especially labor and the environment. Republicans were traditionally more enthusiastic, seen as the party of business, less enthusiastic about labor and environment, but more supportive of trade. Now we have all of that party politics in the US that's been scrambled. And so while Democrats continue to articulate concerns about labor and the environment, especially the Biden White House and particularly the US Trade Representative, Katherine Tai, it's not clear that that's the only concern for Democrats. And some Democrats are increasingly sounding far more pro-trade than ever before. At the same time, Republicans are really in a bit of a struggle because their traditional free trade credentials are under threat from the Make America Great Again MAGA crowd who are hostile to trade. So we have this, again, scrambling of domestic level politics on trade that has gotten to be very complicated. So even if you wanted the United States to show leadership on trade, it's unclear who exactly you would be appealing to show that leadership or to provide that kind of renewed enthusiasm for the WTO, multilateralism, or alternatives. As if that wasn't enough of a challenge, of course, the US has increasingly connected national security and politics to economics in a way that we haven't seen for decades out of the US. And so that merger between economics and security in the US is compounding difficulties in especially supporting more integration of economic issues. Because the worry is, what does that do? That leads you to risk, it leads you to dependence. There is another challenge that I will just flag for this audience in case you're not down in the weeds in US politics. It used to be the case, particularly that the Republican Party, but originally bipartisan, then it became the Republican Party, were keenly interested in what US business thought. And if you've been to Washington, you'll know that the US Chamber of Commerce is literally across the street from the White House. And that relationship between business and government has historically been quite tight in the US. However, in the last couple of years, that link between government and business has been broken, and businesses have largely spent the last decade or 10 years or 8 years or something, I guess we could think about the timing, but with their heads underneath the desk, hoping that they are not noticed in Washington. And so that, I think, is a real challenge because it means that the business community is not engaged on these discussions about trade very much at all. They are extremely disconnected, particularly from USTR at the moment. Again, I'm happy to discuss this more in the Q&A, why that is the case. They are not part of the discussions in Congress. And so again, if you're trying to think about trade as a means to support business engagement, if the business community isn't keen, then leadership is also missing from this action. So this hope that somehow the United States will snap back or revert to normal I think is misguided. I think whatever normal looks like in the future, it will be a problem for the US to regain whatever it used to say on trade, because the politics have changed in Washington, the geopolitical context has changed in Washington, the connections with business have changed in Washington. And so this is a real, I mean, again, we could keep trying to get the US to be engaged in the WTO and other multilateral initiatives. But as we'll see when I talk about IPEF in a minute, their version of what trade looks like going forward is quite different from what it looked like in the past. So I think that's just worth noting and repeatedly noting it, because our systems, in many cases, I would argue, of trade have relied on a certain way of US behavior and US leadership in structuring outcomes, which I think is now not going to happen for I don't know how long. So if it's not the US, then who? Now here's the challenge, right? If it's not the US who's really pushing a multilateral system to be open, inclusive, engaged, proactive, tackling the problems of the day, then who is that going to be? Well, the European Union is a possibility, but the EU itself has always had a hard time managing trade. And in particular, the loss of the UK to Brexit has probably not helped the EU's overall free trade ambitions, because within the European Union, it was the Brits who were the most enthusiastic supporters of integration, free trade, openness, liberalization. With them out, there's even more enthusiasm by some of the members of the EU to remain inward, nationalist, protectionist, et cetera, especially to promote the different sort of trade agenda. If you promote trade at all, it's about labor, environment, sustainability, standards, competition. It's a different sort of agenda. It's not about tariff reductions. It's not even about services discussions. There's nothing on investment really. So this is a challenge. If the Europeans were going to take up leadership, it would be difficult for them to do, and they would pull the multilateral system in a very different direction. We might think it's fine, just to be clear. We might say that is the direction we should go in, at which point the European Union could become very important. But at the moment, there seems to be some tension about whether the EU wants to really pick up that mantle. And if they did, who would follow them? So Europe is a potential candidate for pulling the multilateral system forward, but I think it's a challenging one. The next alternative, of course, would be the second largest economy, which is China, but of course that leads to a whole new can of worms that is going to be difficult. It's not obvious how much China would want to be a leader, and it's not obvious that others would follow. So I think China could potentially, in a sort of academic, theoretical way, lead, but I think in practical terms that would be very challenging. So that turns us then to Japan as one of the largest markets in the globe and one of the biggest recipients of, I would argue, the benefits of integration and trade openness. So I think Japan could certainly be a leader in pushing WTO reform, but also return to multilateralism, a different kind of engagement. But that is a very different role from the way that Japan has traditionally conducted policy, and especially trade policy. So I think there's the possibility of Japan playing an important role. But given Japan's sort of natural instincts, I would say, to me, it's unlikely that Japan, and this is why I'm excited about being here and getting comments from you, whether Japan would do so independently, I'm thinking no, but it could do so obviously as part of the coalition of middle powers. And so you can see Japan is active in a number of arrangements to try to support the multilateral system, including things like the alternative dispute system, many of the plurilaterals and joint statement initiatives, et cetera. And so I think there's the possibility for something around middle powers. But that also requires a recognition that some middle powers actually do not like this agenda, especially India and South Africa, do not like this plurilateral alternative agenda. And so even a coalition of middle powers doesn't automatically guarantee that we get the same kind of WTO or multilateral approaches that we've had in the past. I could imagine, just as likely, a coalition of middle powers that is hostile to the idea of integration, forming and actually being able to push through a certain amount of their agenda. So I think The long and the short of that is that the WTO is going to be hamstrung for, unfortunately, in my view, quite some time to come. And so we have to figure out how to do alternatives. So in that vein of trying to think about alternatives, what can we do? Well, can you create these especially sort of regional initiatives and have those regional initiatives build up and build out and eventually come back and you end up with another global system? I think it's possible, but I think there have to be some recognition, some clear-eyed recognition of the challenges. So one challenge we have, you can see from the RCEP discussions. So the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership started as a way to knit together 5 separate ASEAN +1 agreements. And the idea was you could just, lay all 5 of them out, bundle the things together, RCEP. It was going to be fast, it was going to be easy. Unfortunately, all 5 of them were quite different. And ASEAN-Japan, for example, is a wretched agreement that never got past trade in goods. ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, ANSFTA was far more comprehensive. And so trying to bridge those gaps, even among the members who had an agreement with ASEAN, was difficult. And as you certainly know, it was very hard for the members in RCEP who did not already have existing agreements, particularly Japan, Korea, and China, to cooperate together under this umbrella. It took 8 years, and the whole agreement ultimately looks quite different from the underlying ASEAN +1 agreements. And the point, I think, is that you can say that it's easy to take a pathfinder approach, right? To have one agreement that becomes the basis for some future something. But in practice, that's hard, because members will say, well, what I agreed to do with you in that time period is not necessarily what I want to do with these other folks at some different time period. And so you can see in the RCEP negotiations, in my view, the difficulty of trying to take an existing underlying set of agreements and turn them into something bigger. This is a problem just from the ASEAN agreements to 16 members. You can imagine if the coalition was even bigger, how hard it is to get everybody to agree and then agree to expand. So I think it's possible, but it's hard. And another example of how challenging this is think about how hard it's been to add new members to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. Now that agreement in some ways should have been easy to add a new member, because we're not changing the text, not changing the commitments and schedules of the existing members. It's just about the new member accession on very specific areas. So that should have been fast and easy, especially since it was the United Kingdom that came first. UK's top priority is to do CPTPP accession. CPTPP members should have said, this is our best opportunity to have an enthusiastic member come in and, voila, we have CPTPP. Actually, it took 2 years. It took 2 years, and now we're still at a substantial conclusion, and they're wrangling over dairy still. And so it shows to me, again, the difficulties of just making an agreement bigger by adding in new members. Every new member is going to have new issues. Those issues come up in unexpected places and in unexpected ways. And so even an relatively easy member, I would argue, like the United Kingdom, which has almost no trade, honestly, with CPTPP countries, is difficult. Imagine, again, the complexity of trying to add a big member that does have trade, like China, or the geopolitical contest we have ahead with Taiwan, or even just expanding to new members with whom we have very little past experience, like Costa Rica or Uruguay, like what that looks like. So it sounds simple to say we should just add members, it's great, but actually the process of adding members is difficult. And once we do that, so now we have the agreement, here it is, fantastic. What are we going to do with it? So one of the challenges that we have right now for many of these, first of all, for RCEP and TPP both, implementation is very weak. There isn't a government in CPTPP that has actually delivered all of their commitments in the CPTPP. Let me just give you one simple one, because I know people will ask. There's a commitment, just a simple one. Government procurement chapter requires that members every 6 months update their thresholds for government procurement contracts. They're written in the agreement under something called a special drawing right, or SDR. That's supposed to be translated in every 6 months into your currency, and those thresholds, which change every year, are supposed to be publicly available. And guess what? Not, as far as I can tell, not a single member anywhere has actually done this. So the problem we've got is that implementation, even among very competent, very organized members of some of these agreements, is always a challenge. And when we get to the new and more exciting, sort of sexier topics, it's even harder, like these digital only agreements. We have two versions of the digital only agreements going forward right now. One is the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DEPA, between Chile, Singapore, and New Zealand, with South Korea, Canada, and China all in accession talks. That's meant to be a sort of standalone. It not only does it have the commitments, but it actually has a dispute system because it's a standalone agreement. Then there's a second version of these digital only agreements. Singapore is leading the way in one with Australia, with South Korea, and with the UK. Those DEAs are meant to be hooked to a free trade agreement. So they benefit from the entire infrastructure of the FTA as well. But the problem with both of them, the DEPAs and the DEAs, is it's nice to have the agreement, but then what? How do we actually implement some of these commitments? What are we actually going to do to encourage, for example, digital identity? It's one thing to say we should cooperate on digital identity. It's another thing to say, well, okay, cooperate to do what? Who's cooperating? Who's cooperating with whom? Under what time frame? What are the projects or programs or ideas that we have? So a lot of the implementation is really missing on some of these newer ideas. And it gets worse when we look at even more sort of cutting edge areas like trade and gender, which, you know, Australia and the UK made a chapter on trade and gender. Fantastic. So now what? How do we make gender part of a trade deal? What are we going to do about climate or sustainability? Could we have a special agreement just on like health? I mean, we could do lots of things, but it's not just negotiating that's hard, it's the implementation that's also a challenge. And so we have to think about not just how do you create an agreement, but then how do you get that agreement implemented in the future? So some real issues that we have to think about. Before I close, let me just mention two more things that I think are relevant. So one way to do this, says the Americans in particular, is to say, well, let's do a new model. Let's not do trade agreements in the way that we used to do them. Let's think about a completely alternative model. So, hence, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF, which has these sort of pillars of activity, and inside the pillars of activity are a range of legally binding and cooperative kinds of commitments, including one called trade. But if you actually look at what's in trade, and I'm sure that this has occurred to folks at METI, most of that is not your responsibility. So the challenge we have is that we've given the trade ministries a trade pillar that doesn't have much to do with their actual remit during the day. So most of you are not in environment, most of you are not doing labor, most of you are not doing inclusive trade, most of you don't deal with agriculture because you have a separate ministry for that. Trade facilitation is usually handled by Customs and Ministry of Finance. Technical assistance is often not run through the trade ministry. And so we have a trade pillar that actually doesn't go to the competence of officials at places like METI. So this is a challenge. Doesn't mean that it can't be fixed, but it does mean that it's, you know, now you're coordinating not just with 14 members, but also crucially with all of your domestic stakeholders and your domestic ministries and agencies. And sometimes that is much more complicated than dealing with your international counterparts. The timelines on this are very tight. The next round is coming up very, very fast, and they want to be able to announce something sexy and exciting in November, which means in practice, you have to be wrapped up by August on whatever you intend to do. So, this is a challenge. And if at the end of the day, you announce it and it's not interesting, then what, right? So what are we gonna do if this new model doesn't appeal, doesn't fire up imaginations? And what are we gonna do with the relationship between IPEF and APEC? Because I know we have some folks on the call who are keen on APEC. If IPEF is supposed to be more of like a think incubator of ideas, then what is APEC for? I mean, it's a slightly different membership, but the point remains, like, we have to be careful about what exactly we are incubating. As I mentioned here, and I'll just skip over this one really, just to say that, despite this new model, Asia tends to prefer traditional FTA arrangements and have been very active in agreeing to these kinds of arrangements, RCEP, CPTPP, the European Union models, et cetera. And so even within ASEAN, they look very traditional. So it suggests that Asia doesn't yet see that we need a completely new model of trade. But if we're going to need a new model of trade, and I think this is my last point before I wrap this up, what we desperately need are more trade secretariats that can help manage what is a very complicated structure. So we currently only have two. We have one for ASEAN, which is not as functional as you would like it to be, partly because of ASEAN. We have an APEC secretariat, which has been very helpful for a small outfit. RCEP is supposed to have a secretariat, but we keep arguing over who's going to fund it and where it's going to be. So the first order of business for RCEP was to make a secretariat. The agreement has now been in place for 18 months, in force for 18 months, and we still don't have a secretariat. So this is a challenge. And it cannot be, let me just make this point, and I please Japan make this point as loudly as you can to your counterparts in ASEAN. It cannot be a department within the ASEAN secretariat. The ASEAN secretariat is already overwhelmed, dysfunctional, trying to manage ASEAN's agenda. If the RCEP secretariat becomes a section within this larger ASEAN secretariat, it will not help with the implementation and the future expansion of RCEP. It will be unable to do that. So we really need to have a good RCEP secretariat that will manage implementation, that will manage future cooperation, will serve as the focal point for development aid projects and programming, et cetera. So you need to focus on that one. Don't let Indonesia tell you we're just putting it in as a department within the ASEAN Secretariat. The second one, and again, please Japan, we need a secretariat for CPTPP. This is way too complicated of an agreement to manage on the side of your regular job. You need to have someone who's full-time on the task, who can handle these accessions, who can deal with the implementation. And if you don't do it, someone else is going to grab it. So if we don't get a CPTPP secretariat in Tokyo, which would be my preferred choice, then I'm going to suggest London do it. UK is very enthusiastic. We might as well put the CPTPP secretariat in London. And so think hard about that one. But we need a secretariat that can manage this, especially because if the global system continues to creak and crumble, we need to have some other standing bodies of trade expertise ready and able to fill in those gaps. And so it's urgent. It's been urgent anyways that we have a secretary, but it's really urgent right now when the global trading system is in such disarray that we get these secretariats for these larger regional agreements up and running, and we make them as functional as we possibly can. And the last slide I just want to say here is, we now have the greatest challenges to trade, I think, in a very long time, lifetimes, I would say. And so those alternative arrangements, although we might all say we prefer the multilateral system to be working, that's the first best option. We have to be serious about the second options and third options at this point. And Asia, as a very trade-dependent region, and I would argue Japan as a trade-dependent leader in Asia, needs to think harder about how do we make sure that those alternative arrangements are fit for purpose themselves, that they have a structure and an institutional outcome that can support open trade lanes and can support conversations about trade issues that otherwise are going to be stuck and stymied because we just don't have a lot of alternatives if the global system remains stuck and if we continue to have this geopolitical contest going on. And so trying to think harder about how to leverage our existing structures, I think, is more important than ever. And in that context, again, that's why I was very excited to accept this invitation from RIETI, because I think Japan has actually a really key role to play in making trade fit for purpose for today and then potentially into the future, because the alternative, in my view, is quite alarming. So let me stop there. Let me stop share. There we go. And turn it back over to my colleagues in Japan, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Elms, for your excellent presentation. And we truly got to understand the nature of this difficult challenge. And also, thank you so much for your providing us a number of solutions for that.